All right, good morning. I've just hit the record button, so everyone should get a little notification that we are recording this. My name is Eli Storch. I'm the chair of the Design Advocacy Group, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to our monthly meeting for December. Talk about modern housing, affordable housing, and other housing-related items here in Philadelphia. Before we get into the announcements and into our program, I just wanted to go through a few reminders and other advocacy items that have come up internally. So please mute yourselves as you come in. If you have any technical difficulties, reach out to Claire Adler or David Brownlee in the chat, and they will do their best to assist you with whatever they can. Typically in the past, our DAG meetings have been off the record. But given the ability to share our content a little bit more broadly by recording and posting these meetings, we've elected to do that. So in a day or two, this will be public on our website. You can share this around with anyone who wasn't able to attend. And if you go there now, you can check out some of our wonderful recent programming. We had Lex Powers from SEPTA talking about the Rail Transit Wayfinding Master Plan. An evening panel called Whose History Is It? The Democratization of Preservation. And Tonetta Graham gave a really wonderful presentation about historic home repair in Strawberry Mansion. We have a few things that I'm going to talk about, but if you have any announcements, anything that you want to share with the group, please put it in the chat. There will be an announcement section shortly. So while I'm speaking, if you can put any of those in the chat there, and we'll make sure to get to all of them. But first, I'm very thrilled to announce that DAG has 3 new steering committee members. I see a couple of them are here today. Faye Anderson, the director of All That Philly Jazz and a prominent advocate for African-American cultural heritage and historic preservation in the city of Philadelphia, has joined us. Tavis Dockwiller, the founding principal of Viridian Landscape Studio and a member of Civic Design Review, as well as Akeem Dixon, founder of The Intersect, who brings a lot of experience in community economic development and work on commercial corridors to DAG. So I'll give a round of applause. We are much better for having the 3 of them with us, and we're excited to continue bringing new expertise into our steering committee. And I get to continue with good news because our honorary chair for Dig Deep for DAG, which is our fundraising campaign, which is ongoing, John Gattuso and Gattuso Development Partners. I am happy to announce that they have shared a $1,000 matching grant to help us get to our goal for our fundraiser. We're more than 70% of the way there, and to help us get over the line, Gattuso Development Partners has put up a $1,000 match. So Claire's going to put the link in the chat. Anything you're able to give, our donations to DAG are tax deductible. And as we look to raise not only funds, but also grow our donor base, please know that any donation goes a long way in helping us keep this programming going. And so if you like what we do and you're enjoying being a part of DAG, please head to that link and send a few bucks our way. It is a real help. So I'm not seeing any announcements yet, but I want to go through a couple internal things that I know George Claflin and David Brownlee have prepared. So George and David, we're going to put your slides up, and George, if you want to take it away, discussing outdoor dining.
Yeah, I'll start. I think Claire has the slides. If you could just take over the screen, Claire. The slides are just a little preamble to, I think, a statement that David wants to make, but I had a chance to look at a few restaurants over time, starting from the summer, mostly in the area west of Broad Street. So here's Harper's Garden. We can go to the next slide. That's in the summer. Here it is as it was being prepared for the winter with this ad hoc gas-powered heating system. And if you look again, the next couple of slides, it looks kind of ad hoc, to put it mildly. And the city does not really want these bays to be closed on all four sides plus a roof. So I don't know whether, and here's another one from Harper's Garden. You might call these COVID cabins. I'm not sure they're really healthy, but that's a question that we want to raise. Okay, let's go. Okay, here's the dandelion, also over the summer. And next, yeah, okay, here it is under construction, and there it is as it's finished with the heating plant. I didn't see any signs on or marks on the plywood saying it was fire retardant. This one appears to be closed on. This one actually looks like it comes close to meeting the rules in that it's open on four sides, but partially open, so the air can actually move through this. This is at a kitchen. Okay. Here's Park. And Park has two of these, one on Locust and one on 18th Street. And here's, again, the issue. This is at Butcher and Singer. You can see they've used industrial closures on the sidewalk side, which really closes it on four of the vertical sides. Okay, and I think, yeah, this is Locust Street where it gets pretty crowded. This one has an ambitious roof via Locusta, and then the second Park in the background. Okay, here's one, the former Roosevelt pub, now called, I think, Rosie's something or other. Looks quite dangerous, covered with plastic on all sides. Okay.
Ridiculous.
And I think just we can leave these up while David talks. These are the city rules that were only promulgated in October, and as you can see, anything that is not an open air tent comes under option 3, the bottom one, other shelter options, which means it needs L&I and the street department permit. And then there's another page to this, just the last page. A building permit from L&I is required for a custom-built shelter with overhead cover or sides more than 4 feet in height. And they also want an engineer's certification on air changes. So I'm going to stop there and let David comment further.
Thanks, George. I just really want to say 2 things. I mean, I think that there are 2 important issues here. One is the urban design question, and I think most of us would welcome the activation of sidewalks, the conversion of some parking lanes into other uses. I think we all appreciate that. I think it's clear that if for this to work, there actually does need to be some clear guidance as to about keeping the right-of-way open, obviously about using safe materials and safe technology for construction. And I think that we are pretty short of that. Some of these are quite ambitious and handsome, and some of them look actually like fire hazards. I mean, the second question is the public health question, is whether these actually are outdoor dining if you're enclosed with plastic on all 4 sides, or even on 3 sides. I was at my dentist earlier this week, everybody in full PPE, and she said that she and her husband had not gone out to any of these constructions, which she referred to as petri dishes, which I thought was good. And I also think that the Mexican restaurants who build them should actually just call them Corona, Corona castles or Corona casitas. I think is a vexing problem, and I think we're all desperate to get back to normal life. But I do worry about where desperation takes us. So
thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe shift on to the other little slideshow that I put together.
Absolutely.
So yesterday I got an email from the architectural historian William Curtis, who lives in France, but who does a great deal of work in South Asia. And he informed me that the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, India, has just put out an RFP for the demolition and replacement of the dormitories at the Indian Institute of Management, which is the campus that Louis Kahn designed and built there in the 60s, one of the most important works of his mature career in the 60s. The dormitories are circled in red in the slide that you see on the top right, and there's a close-up of them down below. The dormitories are arranged diagonally, radiating outward from the big courtyarded instructional building, which you see on the left. Kahn conceived of this in a very Jeffersonian way as you might say, an academical village, with classrooms arranged around shady walkways, as you see on the left. And then on the next, please, Claire, the next. And dormitories immediately adjacent. Kahn famously liked to describe in romantic and poetic terms the institutions that his buildings were designed to serve. And he said that schools began with a man under a tree who did not know that he was a teacher talking to others who did not know they were students. And he imagined, I'm quite sure, that this kind of an environment of shady walkways and clustered dwellings would be the kind of environment in which no one would know what they were doing, but they would all learn. Could I have the next, please? It's a remarkably beautiful place. Like almost all of Kahn's architecture, the geometry is powerful. The dormitories are in fact, each of them a perfect square, but sliced with a diagonal through it, and then of course opened up with strong arches. Could I have the next, please? The spaces in between are particularly wonderful. In plan, it looks very clear and orderly, but those diagonals are extraordinarily difficult to read as one goes through it. And so one has a kind of perpetual sense of discovery as one moves from one small courtyard to another. Could I have the next, please? And then of course, the buildings are made of brick, local brick, which Kahn embraced as a boy from a brick city of Philadelphia, going to India and finding, if anything, a culture that was an architectural culture that was even more centered on brick. And in building, could I have the next, please, at Ahmedabad in brick, it is in that context that he seems to have developed his famous aphorism, his conversation with a brick, which for those of you who haven't read it, you deserve to hear it again. And you deserve to see it. And if you've heard it before, you deserve to hear it again. You say to brick, what do you want, brick? Brick says to you, I like an arch. If you say to brick, arches are expensive and I can use a concrete lintel over an opening, what do you think of that, brick? Brick replies, I like an arch. That's it. We can stop there, I think, Claire. What the Indian Institute of Management has put out a proposal for is to tear down all these buildings. They say they direct architects to send in their credentials. The plan is to replace the buildings with buildings on the same footprint, but with no guidance that they should be replicas or even that they should be respectful of the vocabulary of Kahn's architecture. The site has been badly maintained over the years. Most of those slides I took 30 years ago. And it suffered an earthquake several years ago, and the Institute says that their attempts to repair the buildings have been unsatisfactory. The only thing I can say is that in building that campus, Kahn created one of the most satisfactory campus environments I've ever seen. And I've always thought that if somehow or other he had managed to build those buildings in America, American campus design would have been a lot better for the last 40 years. So I will subsequently be able to advise people where to send protests. I don't have that information yet.
I appreciate you sharing this information with us, and disappointed to see that development. But once we have that information, we'll put it out on social media and on our website so we can share it with everyone.
I mean, just to say the obvious, we talk a lot about the preservation of Philadelphia architecture. Well, in this case, it happens that this very important example of Philadelphia architecture is in India.
Well, thank you, David. I'm going to now pass it over to Marcia Moss to give us an update on our upcoming programming for DAG. Marcia, do you want to take it away? Marcia, you're muted. So while Marcia gets her microphone going, if anyone has any announcements, I'm not seeing any just yet, but please add them into the chat here, and I'll make sure to call on you as you have the opportunity to do that. So since it looks like Marcia is struggling with her microphone, I see you, Marcia. I see you fighting with it. But I guess I'll just announce in our next program is going to be January 14th. Ashley Hahn, who's here today. Hi, Ashley. It's nice to have you. Ashley will be discussing preservation in the public realm. That program is up on our website, January 14th from 10 to 11:30. If you sign up for that, you'll get the link for Zoom and be able to attend that one. We're continuing with a bunch of programming and we'll be announcing that shortly into February and March as our DAG charrette is completed on the Schuylkill, and some other interesting programming as well. I see from George that there is an announcement. George, do you want to take it away?
Just a quick shout out to Greg Heller, who I see is on the call. He was written up in the New York Times. He's a man who has a very hard job of spending $60 million in the next 2 weeks, I believe, in housing subsidies. And it describes a little bit of how difficult that actually is to make happen. So thank you for your efforts, Greg. Good to see you.
Thanks a lot, George. I appreciate it.
So I'm going to keep going. I'm not seeing any specific additional announcements. Claire has posted the Eventbrite link for Ashley's talk in January, so you can take a look. You can click on that, as well as the Dig Deep for DAG link to our fundraising campaign. So the last couple bits of business before we get started, we have begun a new feature called the DAG Dispatch. Comes out every Monday morning, and it's a summary of the week's real estate and development and architecture and urban design news. Not truly exhaustive, but certainly a good primer on what's been going on for the week, and we're continuing to grow that. So check that out. That goes up on our website and all of our social media platforms Monday morning. And also we're expanding our forum. We've been getting some really wonderful new pieces. Emily Smith, the executive director of the Magic Gardens, wrote a great piece about the ongoing saga with the Painted Bride in Old City. DAG's, I can now say DAG's own Faye Anderson wrote a wonderful piece on attempts to preserve the historic Henry Minton House. So if you would like to submit a piece, an opinion piece, a thought piece, whatever you're working on, thinking on, get in touch with David Brownlee through the forum page. Or through our website to dagfellow@gmail.com. So with that, let's dive into this morning's program. Throughout the presentation, please add any questions into the chat. There will be a Q&A at the end, so we will do our best to get to everyone's questions. Please use that chat window. And let me pass it over to George Claflin so that he can introduce our speaker. George?
Thank you, Eli. It's my pleasure to introduce Nikil Saval, who is I would hope he would answer to the category of public intellectual. He has written about cubicle culture. He has written about planners having a new and more exciting life than they used to have. He is captivated by the design professions, although his own PhD is in English literature, I believe. He grew up in LA. He went to Columbia University and then got his PhD from Stanford. And he has managed to get himself elected state senator from District 1, ousting a young but old line political force to get that position. And we are very excited about having him in the state legislature. He has also edited N+1, which is not a mathematics journal. I'm showing it on my window if anybody has my window on the screen. It's not a mathematics journal at all, but it's a cultural journal. And his book on cubicle culture was honored, in my opinion, to be reviewed by Richard Sennett, one of the leading forces in sociology as related to the built environment and design. So in the design and architectural world, we're always really excited if someone from another world is captivated by our circumstances. And Nikil has said that numerous times. And without any further elaboration, I'll turn it over to Nikil.
Thank you, George. Thank you for that very, very kind and generous introduction. Thank you to DAG for having me. This is, real honor. I, as I said to George, I think on the phone, I'm sort of an interloper in the world of design, a bit of an amateur. So I see these occasions as attempts, as places where I can try out ideas and sort of, get feedback and thoughts from people. So please ask questions. And though this topic of this will be actually somewhat historical in nature, I'm obviously happy to answer questions on sort of any subject, political or otherwise, or to talk through things. So my invitation to speak, I guess I should share. Let's see this is my screen. There we go. Okay. So my invitation to speak, as well as the title and subject for this talk, are fairly fortuitous. Happened to be taking a long afternoon walk on a Saturday afternoon during my toddler's nap time through Bingham Court in Society Hill, and the end product of an enormous process of urban renewal, on the phone with a political scientist discussing the once relieving and also murky and dispiriting results of the general election, when I was identified by Marsha Moss, who noted that she made many attempts to reach me and was glad to have finally encountered me by chance. And there, in the home of one of the city's largest slum clearance programs, among houses that were once considered modern, I thought at that point of attacking the subject that had been a great inspiration of my run for office, which is the need to increase our stock of affordable housing in Philadelphia and the Commonwealth more generally. But the title and a lot of the subject of my talk today is a reference to a neglected classic of the modern movement for social housing, titled Modern Housing, written by the once renowned and now in some sense largely little known, at least comparatively little known, urbanist and thinker Catherine Bauer, who is pictured there. Modern Housing came out in 1934 in the depths of the Depression, as the various intellectual forces that coalesced and came into conflict under the New Deal were becoming living features of public policy. An architecture student who became interested in the modern movement, Bauer was inspired by architectural modernism's commitment to social housing, and she moved from being an aesthete to an enthusiastic promoter of public housing. She was a founder of the Labor Housing Conference, which was founded here in Philadelphia, which brought together building trades and other union members to build limited dividend housing and to advocate for federal investments in housing, whose first meeting was in Chancellor Street in Rittenhouse Square. One of the great outcomes for the labor movement for housing was the Carl Mackley homes, which I'll discuss later, still standing in North Philadelphia. She became one of the primary authors of FDR's landmark Housing Act of 1937, which inaugurated the era of American public housing. Well into the 1950s, she was a fixture of housing and architectural circles, and she died in 1964 in a freak hiking accident in the Bay Area, still at the height of her career. At the same time, tied to a European idea of social housing that never took hold, and a public housing program that was already by the late 1950s running into serious forms of opposition, including from increasingly segregated and poor public housing residents, Bauer became less famous than another urbanist critic who was both a friend and a sparring partner, Jane Jacobs. In fact, many people may know Bauer's name more from Jacobs' masterpiece, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, than they do from Bauer's own work. In Death and Life, Bauer's work comes in for heavy criticism, associated with that of Lewis Mumford, then the writer of the Skyline column for the New Yorker. Bauer, associated with Lewis Mumford. Jacobs accuses Bauer of being hostile to street life and to the mixing of commerce and residences which she had argued had become an orthodox and outdated form of planning. Above all, Jacobs was hostile to public housing projects, which took up super blocks and resulted in isolation and ultimately in increased rates of crime. And we'll come back to that. To a degree, it was Jacobs's vision that won out. Public housing projects have come down everywhere, replaced with low-rise housing that sometimes emphasizes street life. Indeed, here and in many other societies, the state has mostly withdrawn from the provision of public housing. In its place has arisen a patchwork of policies that leave thousands and thousands on the waiting list for subsidized housing of any kind. The premise for this lecture is that the circumstances for the intellectual and actual diminution of government support for social housing may have changed. We face what is obviously a deepening housing crisis, exacerbated by the public health catastrophe of COVID-19, in which rental debt is accumulating, mortgage debt is being postponed, and in which years of restrictive zoning, no restrictions on the price of land, and the lack of investment in affordable housing has produced an overwhelming shortage of homes, even for middle-class residents. Whether we incline to accept the conclusions of modern housing, which validated European functionalism in architecture and its overall social housing program, I believe we are more and more inclined to agree with Bauer when she wrote in the introduction to modern housing that, quote, although it is not true that any social economic order which could produce good housing would be ipso facto a good system, it is certainly true that any arrangement which cannot do so is a reactionary and antisocial one. This lecture begins with how the question of social housing was posed here in Philadelphia and to the world, and Bauer's ultimately quixotic attempt to secure it, and ends with the question of whether that attempt can, in our current circumstances, be resurrected. This is a young Catherine Bauer. She was born in New Jersey in 1905, studied art history at Vassar, and for a year had transferred to the architecture school at Cornell. She quickly lost interest, however, in what she later called the combination of archaeology and fancy watercolor rendering that then largely constituted architectural education. After graduation in 1926, she spent a year in Paris, where she first became acquainted with the functionalist aesthetic in architecture. In her first significant article written for the New York Times in the late 1920s, Machine-Age Mansions for Ultramoderns, French builders apply ideas of the steel and concrete era in domestic architecture. She describes how astonished French architects were at Americans who produced extraordinary cars and buildings for industry, but who in their homes were, quote, still copying tarnished chateaux, drafty villas, and musty cottages for our dwelling places. After returning to the United States, Bauer took up residence in Greenwich Village and became introduced to the critic Lewis Mumford. They shared a passion for modern architecture, and Bauer and Mumford became romantically involved as well. Through Mumford, Bauer became introduced to the Regional Planning Association of America, the RPAA, known at the time for being a proponent of garden cities. Its members were opposed to what they saw as the uncontrolled growth of the urban environment and were instead proponents of a conscious, rational form of planning that considered development on a regional scale. Moreover, they were opposed to the sheer expense of American housing, which they considered both wasteful and extravagant, as the writer Henry Wright charged in an article in 1925. Speculation encouraged both bad housing and an unmanageable increase in land values. But the answer could not be simply at the building level. Solutions had to be sought, Mumford argued, not in terms of the individual cell, but in terms of the larger unit. Not the house, but the neighborhood. What Bauer brought to this was a particular interest in European architectural trends, but also the subordination of these trends to the broader project of housing not just the poor, but the working and middle classes. Over the course of the early 1930s, she visited interwar Germany, where she marveled that Frankfurt had built, these are projects built by Ernst May, had built 160,000 new units of housing, enough to house about 10% of its population. She then joined Mumford later in traveling throughout Europe, subsidized by Fortune magazine. At the end of it, she had become a housing expert to such an extent that her affair with Mumford came to an end. He complained in a letter to her, "I reach for you and what do I touch? A housing expert. I call for you in the stillness of the night and what do I hear? The percentages of vacancies in Laubengang apartment houses in Germany as compared with cottages." Separated from Mumford, Bauer began her book, Modern Housing. The thesis of the book, largely directed at American audiences, was that Europeans had succeeded in creating, in Gail Radford's terms in her book, Modern Housing and the New Deal, an entirely new kind of shelter and a framework for producing it. The 19th century completely failed to grapple, Bauer argued, with industrialization and the burning need for more housing. Many of us will think of the 19th century or early 20th century housing in terms of New York City's tenements, but more common, at least in the United States, were endless suburban style rows of single family homes. This is from Chicago, built cheaply and poorly. Utopian thinkers proposed plans but could not act on them. Philanthropic organizations produced handfuls of plans that often failed to meet the need. The difference in the early 20th century, according to Bauer, is that there was, quote, organized political demand on the part of the people who needed good housing. The net result was a situation in which most new units were removed from the market, at least in Europe. A third had been built, in her estimate, by municipalities on city-owned land. A third were put up by public utility housing societies, and another third were built with private funding, but with rental and resale restrictions put on them. Her book ends with a chapter titled Modern Housing for America. The tone is at once pessimistic and hopeful. She writes of how America's ideal of individual homeownership, our strongest heritage from the frontier, has been exploited so intensively that a very large proportion of the population still tends, in spite of foreclosures, evictions, and the collapse of paper values, to approach the housing problem in the role of petty capitalists rather than as workers and consumers. Even to many of those who have lost or never achieved their own houses, the idea of holding title to a piece of land in a building remains, in spite of all the contrary facts, the vague symbol of both respectable security and sudden riches. In a timeless paragraph, she describes the way that housing has become a public issue in the United States that ensures that everyone will evade the problem. Economists, both liberal and otherwise, urge housing as a means of providing emergency employment and as one of the few potentially self-liquidating forms of public works. Cities and various sections of the financial interest see in it a chance to rehabilitate economically blighted areas. Social workers, politicians, and a few of the more pessimistic slum owners think that housing can mean only the spectacular, immediate clearance of the most noisome slum districts at any cost. Architects and engineers are inclined to feel that housing, however dull by comparison with skyscrapers or Norman villas, is their one glimmer of hope in a drab future. A group of industrialists and technicians is fascinated with the notion that the prefabricated dwelling might, like the automobile industry after the war, provide restless urban unemployed provide an entirely new boom market to exploit. Romantic reactionaries hail it as a means of putting restless urban unemployed safely back on the land in handmade homesteads with vegetable gardens. A few of the more forward-looking see in government-assisted community housing a real tool for regional planning and industrial re-centralization. Others see only new sources for municipal graft. Labor is apparently more worried about the dangers of prefabrication than about either immediate employment or better houses to live in. And the radicals firmly believe, with considerable logic, that this is just one more thing which can never be accomplished within the framework of a capitalist society. For those of us who know the subsequent history of American public housing, Bauer's proposal in this chapter, not to clear what she called, or what many people called for years, slums, but to build alternative, better housing elsewhere, thereby lowering the price of land and drawing people away from affordable settlements, is a path not taken. Modern housing, she writes, if it is to be done at all, cannot be patchwork. It is not reform within the old pattern. It is either an entirely new method of providing an entirely new standard of urban environment, or it is nothing. Once this point of view is accepted, exclusive emphasis on slum clearance becomes as illogical as if the early automobile manufacturers had directed all their efforts to buying out the still prosperous carriage makers and raising their factories instead of building automobiles. Her call at the end is for a social movement, projects that emanates from groups of people, rather than a desire to satisfy the ideal of individual home ownership. And her one example is from Philadelphia, the Karl Mackley homes. Designed by Russian emigre Oscar Stonarov, who later worked with Louis Kahn on public housing, the Mackley homes emanated from the hosiery workers of Philadelphia. John Edelman, the union's director of research, was the son of an architect who had worked with Louis Sullivan in Chicago, so he had an architectural understanding in his household. Along with other leaders of the hosiery workers, they attempted to beat the then Republican machine in Philadelphia by running on labor and socialist party lines for various levels of office, with Edelman himself running for Congress. All of them lost badly. He joked later, "I think we got the smallest vote of any socialist candidates anywhere, ever, at any place in the United States for public office." Nonetheless, the union was thriving because women's skirts had risen and full-fashion silk stockings were in vogue. They were able to mobilize 1,500 cars. So this is Oscar Stonerov on the right. This is out of order. 1,500 cars to mourn Carl Mackley, a union worker killed in a strike in 1930. This is the gathering in Kensington. And with everyone gathered, they pledged in unison. This entire crowd pledged in unison, "I will continue the struggle against low wages, poverty, and oppression, and I will not falter, nor will be intimidated by hired assassins, nor discouraged by a subservient and oftentimes tyrannical judiciary. If necessary, I too will lay down my life in order that all those who toil may be delivered from enslavement by un-American, avaricious, industrial despots." As many people with New York City's familiar with New York City's housing history may know, garment workers were among the first to propose cooperative housing in that city. Philadelphia, by contrast with New York, was held to be an affordable city, but largely because only 20% of its families lived in multi-unit housing. In 1930, 51% of families lived in homes that they owned or were paying for through a mortgage, when the national percentage among major cities was 36%. Row house building brought construction house costs down, and the city had a high concentration of building and loan associations. Nonetheless, the proportion of row house dwelling families in Philadelphia was also due to the lack of alternatives. Many who would have preferred to rent were forced in some ways into buying. This is Front and McKean Street, just a familiar kind of example. Many who had, over the 1920s and 1930s, foreclosures confirmed this fact as thousands lost homes they could not afford. Hosiery workers were particularly badly hit by the Depression, and many lost their homes. Edelman described in his autobiography how he could not bear to visit these union families who had been evicted. As union representative, I would steel myself to visit these families, for I knew I would find the kids crying, the mothers covering their faces with their aprons, the young fathers white-faced and lost. He recalled returning home from these heart-rending scenes night after night, growing more convinced that labor unions, labor people, simply could not allow such suffering to continue. Stoneroff and his partner, Alfred Kastner, working with Edelman, conceived of a model of housing that would break with the row house tradition and also with that of individual ownership. Writing in the Hosiery Workers Union newspaper, Edelman noted that the typical Philadelphia row house block contained 182 homes, each with its own small backyard. If the same block were done as a 4-story apartment home for 300 families, construction costs per unit would be cut in half, and large parts of the block would be left open for playgrounds and adult recreation. Stoneroff and Kastner made the argument that cooperative living would cut against individualistic American attitudes. Despite opposition from the real estate industry, which considered this form of housing socialistic and opposed to American enterprise, Philadelphia City Council eventually voted to support the union's plans, overriding a mayoral veto. As one city council person put it at the time, "It is a mighty poor time to throw all kinds of objections to the passage of legislation desired by public-spirited men and women in their considerable efforts to get employment for people." The design for Carl Mackley changed over time from a modernist high-rise to 4 3-story buildings. They were aligned in relation to the sun rather than to the street, bent at the ends and indented at the center with passageways running in between. The complex had nearly 300 apartments, most of them with porches, a pool, an auditorium, underground garages, a nursery school, basement recreation rooms, and rooftop laundry. This is the pool, long since filled in. I could not find an image of the original 2021 Chancellor Suite, but this This is the current image, obviously, of much of a later development. But in 1934, at 2021 Chancellor Street, the Labor Housing Conference was launched, with Catherine Bauer as its secretary, chaired by James McDevitt, the head of the Philadelphia Building Trades Council. Its aim was to win federal support for housing, continuing the push that had been displayed by unions in the cooperative movement. That year, Bauer helped author a federal bill that would create a United States housing authority, whose purpose was, quote, to construct and aid in the construction of modern large-scale housing available to those families who in good as well as bad times cannot afford to pay the price which will induce the ordinary and usual channels of private enterprise to build such housing. In addition to building directly, making grants and loans to housing agencies, it would make grants and loans to non-governmental housing agencies such as cooperatives and other types of non-commercial housing organizations. This was critical for the Labor Housing Conference, who felt that a number of different mechanisms were necessary in order to succeed against the real estate industry. Whereas other housing advocates were pushing for clearing slums and housing provision that targeted only the very poor, the Labor Housing Conference wanted moderately priced housing focused on the middle classes as well. Over the next few years, Senator Robert Wagner took up the bill and held hearings. Bauer argued vociferously that relying on local housing authorities to produce housing ultimately denied what would happen when the profit motives what was removed from housing construction. Housing needed a spark, which would be provided by, she said, setting up machinery whereby groups of people who desire to secure better housing for themselves may participate directly in the program without waiting for the uncertainties of local authorities. Ultimately, the bill that passed was a defeat for the real estate industry, but with several key compromises that would undermine public housing over the long term. The bill lost the provision on nonprofits and cooperatives. It would also limit itself to the lowest income groups and mandated that housing construction would require slum clearance in equal proportion. Finally, an amendment by Senator Harry Byrd placed a cap on costs that dashed the design hopes of Bauer and other forward-thinking American architects and critics. The bill solidified what historian Gail Radford has called the two tiers of American housing policy. One tier in which the federal government subsidizes through highway expansion, tax credits, et cetera, the growth of single-family suburban homes, and the other in which it offers a comparatively paltry subsidy to public and other forms of subsidized housing. That same year the bill was passed, the Philadelphia Housing Authority was created by the Pennsylvania legislature, and in the years to come, especially in the 1950s, the construction of public housing and the clearance of so-called slums would begin in earnest. This is FDR visiting the opening of a public housing project in Pittsburgh in the 1940s. There is no need to outline beyond a few telegraphic points the diminution of public housing in policy terms in the United States. I feel like we must be familiar with it. In 1973, President Nixon placed a moratorium on new conventional housing projects. There was initiated the scattered site form of housing construction, and in 1974, the Section 8 housing voucher was created. 20 years after the Housing Act of 1937, Bauer began to moderate her own position on the architectural element of public housing. In an article titled "The Dreary Deadlock of Public Housing," she lamented the racial and socioeconomic homogeneity of suburbs and the same of public housing, and she implicated planners and architects. It is high time, she wrote, for architects, planners, and builders to accept their large share of responsibility for the dangerous trend toward complete racial and economic segregation. We have been far too exclusively concerned with techniques for neighborhood planning while ignoring the fact that zoning, restrictive agreements, and large-scale building enterprise, public as well as private, are rapidly pushing us towards a feudal social pattern, which is the very antithesis of democracy. She later wrote, "There is no room in such schemes for individual deviation, for personal initiative and responsibility, for outdoor freedom and privacy, for the type of small-scale business enterprise that plays such an important social role in most slum areas. Management domination is built in, a necessary corollary of architectural form." Here we see the cost of losing social housing's emphasis on housing those of moderate incomes, of funding the cooperative, of aiding groups of people who want to band together to secure housing. it would be too much, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, I mentioned Jane Jacobs earlier, too much to place both of them as antitheses. They were all at the same, at a certain point, part of a kind of spectrum of urban design writing. Here was an urban design conference. You can see sort of sets of photos put together: Lewis Mumford, Ian McHargue, J.B. Jackson, Kahn, Catherine Bauer in the middle, I.M. Pei at the end, and Kevin Lynch, Jane Jacobs, some of the kind of leading architects and writers and thinkers on landscape architecture and cities at the time. Both read each other with profit, and Bauer commented favorably on Jacobs's Death and Life of Great American Cities, despite coming in for heavy criticism in it. But one major distinction was that Bauer persisted in believing in the social housing project, both the idea of social housing and the literal building project itself, whereas Jacobs believed that Bauer could not admit the final truth, that in Jacobs's terms, there should be no more projects, or very few. Much of what Jacobs disliked about Bauer and her support for housing projects was its anti-street ethos, its belief in planning at the superblock level rather than at the level of the street. And much of what distinguishes Death and Life from modern housing is its beautiful evocation of street life. At the same time, where Bauer highlighted the elements of public housing that fostered and increased racial segregation in her later writing, it is my contention that Jacobs's critique implicitly brought in white urban fears about race and crime. For all of Jacobs's wisdom about city planning, there's a question as to what degree it is actually a book about crime prevention, which lays much, likely too much, at the feet of poor design. For context, these are the years, as the British sociologist Stuart Hall has argued, in which mugging, an American term that was then imported to England, had become a moral panic and was justifying, in criminal justice terms, harsher sentencing and harsher policing. Her famous phrase in her book, Eyes on the Street, is a plea for bustling street life, partly in no small measure to prevent crime. Reviewing the book for The New Yorker, Lewis Mumford, who was attacked in the book, and this is a piece that I should note is full of casual misogyny, just in the title itself, Mother Jacobs's Home Remedies, writes insistently in a way that has otherwise, I think, been lost in much of the book's reception, that underneath her thesis, he writes, that the sidewalk, the street, and the neighborhood, in all their higgledy-piggledy, unplanned casualness, the very core of a dynamic urban life, lies a preoccupation that is almost an obsession: the prevention of criminal violence in big cities. From her point of view, Mumford continues, one of the chief mischiefs of contemporary planning is that it reduces the number of streets by creating super blocks reserved almost exclusively for pedestrian movement, free from through-wheel traffic, with the space once preempted by unnecessary paved streets turned into open areas for play or provided with benches for the sedentary enjoyment of adults. Such a separation of automobile and pedestrian runs counter to her private directives for a safe and animated neighborhood, namely to multiply the number of cross streets to greatly widen the sidewalks, to reduce all other open aspects, and to place many types of shops and services on streets now devoted solely to residences. The street is her patent substitute for the more diversified meeting places that traditional cities have always boasted. What is behind Mrs. Jacobs' idea of assigning exclusively to the street the mixed function and varied activities of a well-balanced neighborhood unit? The answer, I repeat, is simple. Her ideal city is mainly an organization for the prevention of crime. He notes that Jacobs laments even many of the great parks of New York City as an invitation to crime, though Jacobs herself was insistent that design could not be the source or the solution for social ills, a manner of thinking she labeled the, quote, the physical fallacy. Her own conclusions were ambiguous on this front, and few of her acolytes took care to avoid environmental determinism in their own proposals. One such influential acolyte was Oscar Newman. Drawing on Jacobs, the Canadian architect and planner Oscar Newman pointed to the crimogenic potential of dark stairwells and blind corridors in Corbusier-style high-rise projects. Given access to New York City's projects, he developed an impressive taxonomy of apartment tower, and he coined the phrase defensible space to describe a model for residential environments which inhibits crime by creating the physical expression of a social fabric that defends itself, and made the case for low-rise construction in a book of the same name. Though received cautiously and ambivalently by his architectural peers, he was a skilled practitioner of the same urbanist invective that brought Jacobs to prominence. It is inconceivable, he wrote, for example, that one genius alone could have been responsible for its creation, he writes breathlessly, of the public housing project. The barren red brick towers stand out as prominent landmarks in our cities, well-built monuments to a half-hearted attempt at benevolence. Defensible Space became the best-selling architecture book of the 1970s. These theories came to be widely adopted here as well as in the United Kingdom, where this is actually an image from a television program based on Oscar Newman's work that aired in the United Kingdom, which correlated the number of floors in a building and with the number of robberies. It was under Newman's influence that the Hope 6 program led to the demolition of high-rise public housing everywhere and the replacement with low-rise housing. And in David Simon's 2015 HBO miniseries, Show Me a Hero, based on Lisa Belkin's 1999 book about the integration of public housing in Yonkers, Oscar Newman appears with his distinctive Amish-style beard to propagate the wisdom of low-rise suburban-style tract homes. In the closing credits to this series, Simon indicates that the public housing theories of Oscar Newman are now widely accepted. I'm going to jump forward a little bit here. The late spring and summer of this year, 2020, the US experienced its largest protest movement in history. It left its mark not just in an enhanced consciousness around policing and prisons, but also housing. On Benjamin Franklin Parkway and outside the Philadelphia Housing Authority, protest encampments of the unhoused, numbering as large as 200 residents, laid out a demand to transfer existing vacant homes, especially those of the Philadelphia Housing Authority, to unhoused residents. After several months of protest, they were able to secure a version of their demands, with a number of residences being transferred in the future to a community land trust, a nonprofit entity that separates the land beneath from the home, ensures that home prices that they can be bought and sold do not rise beyond a proportion agreed upon by the holders of the trust. This was inspired, this model, by Georgia farmers in the 1960s. It's since spread all over the world. This sort of organized effort to secure housing bears in mind Bauer's idea that social housing would never simply be provided because of a rational need for it. We would require an organized effort to secure it. In this instance, it was also an organized effort that specifically rejected the logic in which police and prisons receive the lion's share of public investment compared with housing and social services. Much as 90 years ago, a hosiery worker, Carl Mackley, had been murdered by a strike breaker, escorted by police, animating a collective rage against that political system that allowed this, and ultimately an American version of a labor movement for housing. Today, that need, of course, is paramount. Over 40,000 people remain on the closed waiting list for public housing in Philadelphia. And in lieu of its production, people are finding ways to produce it, from the encampments to tiny homes. Not in order to stymie these efforts, but in order to enhance them and bring them to meet the scale of the problem, our city, state, and country need a new social housing act. A recent report produced by the Justice Collaborative and Data for Progress, written by the sociologist Daniel Aldana Cohen, the economist Mark Paul, suggests that 63% of voters support new investments in social housing, including 56% of Republicans and 53% of independent and third-party voters. The report suggests a green building program and retrofits of existing public housing to produce 12 million units. This is the Via Verde project in the Bronx, which is an example for a lot of authors of the kind of green building affordable housing program that we should be pursuing. In terms of the report, this would not supplant existing reform efforts, such as the Biden administration's case, or the incoming Biden administration's case, to make Section 8 a universal entitlement, but supplement it and actually help it succeed. This is what I would argue is the spirit we need, the spirit of Catherine Bauer, the spirit of social housing, truly to realize the dream of modern housing in Philadelphia. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nikil. One thing, when you went through the legislative history of the Housing Act of 1937, two things I just want to mention. In my view, Catherine Bauer was sort of like the Denise Scott Brown of the period between 1930 and 1964. And she later married William Worcester, who was a seminal dean at the University of California, Berkeley, and the building where the School of Design is at Berkeley has been called Worcester Hall for a long time. It's now been renamed to be Bauer Worcester Hall, and that's just been announced about a week ago. But when you're talking about the legislative history, I'm recalling a book by the political scientist Scott Greer quite long ago, where he described the coalition that led to urban renewal, the Urban Renewal Act, as a very unstable coalition of business interests who wanted to reform the city for real estate and business reasons to a new scale of activity, to the housers, those who wanted to create new and better housing and really address unacceptable housing conditions. And the third group was the planners, with whom he also would lump the architects, whose goal was a planned city, and that each of those goals overlapped, but were not fundamentally compatible. Does that trigger anything in this narrative here?
Sorry, can you do you mind just, I want to can you mind restating that question, George? So does what trouble the?
No, does it trigger anything in the sense that the planners and urban designers seeking the goal of a planned city and planned environments, the housers seeking an authentic and immediate response to the lack of housing, and the business interests concerned with taking over land for other uses, for in some cases downtown office buildings,
right.
In other cases the expansion of institutions. And the urban renewal in Philadelphia has a very bad history of being used as a means of institutional expansion. And the Housing Acts also, as you implied, they had a requirement for housing that had to be, you could not supposedly reduce the amount of housing units through urban renewal, but in fact, many projects did just that. They reduced, they tore down so-called slum houses without replacing them, or they tore them down and replaced them in theory like 6 years later, at a price that the original residents could not have possibly have afforded. So that's what I was just referring to, the three, each of these constituencies, you might say, was on its own trajectory, and it was a political victory to get the three to coalesce into a coalition to get the act passed, but it was ultimately unstable.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And, you know, it's a bit, it's maybe a bit specious on my part to kind of, you know, to highlight or politically romantic to kind of highlight a particular trend that I thought was the best of them, which is the labor movement housing conference, when obviously you need coalitional efforts and you have various kinds of interests that contest against each other. You know, that and ultimately have to be reconciled within, or at least, you know, some have to be elevated and some have to be kind of suppressed. It's just, legislation is complicated. But I think that's right. I think people had various interests in the city, and those interests may have, you know, seem in retrospect in some senses to be anti-city or anti-urban. But a lot of them were, you know, had basic, you know, had an interest. They were competing, I think, in certain instances. And I think the thing that we feel is the most, I think in retrospect, the most kind of damaging is the slum clearance initiative. And this is why, so, you know, Modern Housing, I should note for people, has been reissued recently by the University of Minnesota Press with an excellent introduction by the Berkeley architect and professor Barbara Penner, who's also written quite well, and I've drawn on her work. But I thought that was one of the most interesting aspects of of the social housing proposal, was both that it was geared at people of sort of moderate income. It was essentially a proposal just for the state to produce more housing, which was what the European model offered, and to do so for everyone. And the other side of this is that it fell victim to the kind of slum clearance model, and then also for being entirely geared at the very poor. I think those are the two things that were ultimately, most damaging. And you're right that it was also paired with other projects to transform the city, outright. I mean, there's an argument, I believe it's in that book. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing it. Design After Decline, which suggests that there were other, and it's not unique to this book, that there were other forces tearing at the city. Of course, deindustrialization and things like that in some ways were more consequential than urban renewal. But I think it's clear that the legitimacy of the project of public housing was damaged by the kind of the destruction that it entailed, whether that's destruction for other kinds of projects like commercial real estate or for housing itself.
Thank you, Nikil. There's a cluster of questions here, and I'm going to try to at least allude to them. One group refers to two aspects of recent publications by Inga Saffron. One claiming that we don't have a housing problem, we have a poverty problem. The other is Inga's column on the Biden proposal. And maybe you could comment on both of those if you feel comfortable. I'm not sure what the Biden proposal is exactly. You did refer to it there. I think maybe that you could lead to how do you view the role of the state in the new legislature, which is about to start? Are there things that the state could be done at the state level that would enable opportunities that we have not been able to grasp in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do encourage. I see that John Keating has linked the Inga's column on Biden's Section 8 proposal. I mean, I believe that it is. Someone can correct me in the chat, or generally if I'm wrong, that it is inspired by Matthew Desmond's ideas about making the author of Evicted, about expanding access to Section 8. Right now, it actually serves not as many people as vastly fewer people than it could. There's a lot of Section 8 discrimination, even though there's not supposed to be. There certainly is, and so it is not allowed people to live in the centers of cities and things like that, and kind of it can exacerbate residential segregation. So I think expanding it, as the Biden administration has proposed, is a good idea. I think my proposal is that it's one aspect of a larger kind of housing project, but that involves the state to re-enter in a more serious way the provision of housing. Regarding Inga's point about poverty and that Philadelphia has a poverty problem, not a housing problem. I mean, to some extent, her thesis is it can't not be wrong, in the sense that, like, we have a very low. We obviously have a minimum wage that is set. The federal level has not increased for years. It just generally people don't earn enough to stay in their homes. The highest levels of rent burden are not in the sort of gentrified areas of the city, in the center city, but in North Philadelphia, where housing prices are comparatively cheap, but people don't earn enough to stay in them. But there's another. I mean, I would just qualify that this. I don't see the two things as opposed. We also need investments that allow people to stay in their homes. Much of the cost of housing is in home repairs, for example. that is a huge burden on working class and poor people who are renters or rather homeowners. We also we need investments that make possible for people to avoid eviction in the case of an economic crisis or a sudden change in their circumstances. So I think housing protections are essential. I think they obviously go hand in hand. We need we need an organized labor movement. We need an increase in our wages. We need people to be able to afford to stay in their homes. But that, of course, then brings in turn the ability to people to buy more expensive housing to improve their housing. I mean, I think the two things are connected. So I wouldn't separate those two things out. Though I understand I think her point is well taken. In terms of what the state can do, well, I've got some legislation that I'm working on. No, I don't want to kind of we have. I hope I haven't embarrassed my staff. We have and some of whom may be on this call. We have a strong emphasis on housing in my new Senate staff. Jane Allen, who comes from PHDC and the Redevelopment Authority, George Donnelly, who's the tenants' rights lawyer from the Public Interest Law Center, Julia Tackett, who is doing a restore and repair program, Emma Borbor, who comes from the Women's Community Revitalization Project, much more skilled in some sense and who know much more about it than I do. But one thing that we should be thinking about is, there is a lot of state grant money. And I want to just think about immediate terms. I think there are long-term solutions, but just in terms of immediate solutions, I want to point out that a lot of state grant funding, the RCAP funding program, RAC Redevelopment Assistance Capitalization Program, much of that money in the first Senate district has gone largely to kind of commercial projects, commercial real estate, luxury hotel development, some work in the Navy Yard, some of which is necessary for those projects even to succeed. We don't want to actually, but on the other hand, we've neglected, I think, the actual development of affordable housing and the gearing of grants in particular to affordable housing projects. The other, I think, is to the extent that city and state affordable housing trust funds can gear investments towards things like community land trusts. So, for example, in Baltimore, they have revised the terms of their trust fund so that money can actually be geared towards nonprofits. This is actually in the spirit of Bauer's housing proposal, that you want where you can have people banding together to kind of produce housing. They just need support. And so ways that we can support land trusts and things like that, especially in a city where there's large numbers of vacant homes. In certain areas, the price of land makes that possible, not in some of the tighter areas where I think you need direct investments in affordable and construction of affordable housing. The other is just, and this is a more speculative idea, is to the extent to which we can make it possible, and this maybe can help land trusts to dispose of vacant land and vacant homes in a way that makes it possible to have them rehabbed, retrofitted, and make them affordable. They can be disposed to limited equity co-ops, to land trusts, what have you. But I think that is sort of a missing component. The land bank in the city is complicated, as people know. We're not quite able to do that. So those are the things. I mean, in the near term, I think we need, and not to get too deep into the politics of this, but we need a recovery sort of budget for housing. We need to be protecting renters and making sure that people are able to stay in their homes, to defer mortgages and forgive rents to the extent that we can. This debt is accumulating and it's going to be a huge disaster. And have I support a moratorium on evictions, of course. And so, so I think there's lots, the other thing, so sorry, I'm just rambling here, but the other is just the extent to which we can encourage the end of exclusionary zoning, especially in rich areas that are not producing enough housing and should be, suburbs, things like that. I think there is some room for that produces not as many units as I think we need. But I think it's certainly a component of a larger housing project.
Thank you. I have a question here from M. Duffin to everyone. Question: do you see the Philadelphia row house tradition a benefit or a detriment to housing needs in the city? As my father was with PHDC when it was formed in the late 60s, PHDC was formed as a reaction to the PHA approach to housing, and a study by a Columbia professor who said the Philadelphia row house was a solid and efficient housing stock for low-cost housing, which the city should support, which PHDC worked to do, primarily rehabbing rather than demolishing. That's the chat question. Any?
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence is equivocal, and in the sense that that's obviously true in many parts of the city. I mean, I think that the row houses, I mean, if you, I believe we have some passive house experts on this call, so I don't want to step out of my lane here who may know, but from what I've heard from passive, kind of people who build passive housing or net zero housing, row houses can actually be useful forms for that kind of construction. They are efficient. They when they were built, they lowered construction costs, so to the extent that we can keep those row houses and keep them affordable and keep the sunk cost and capital and energy in them, I think it makes sense. Obviously in richer neighborhoods or in gentrifying neighborhoods, if you sort of don't confront the density problem, or if you don't confront the fact that by not sort of alleviating the need for multi-units or things like that in those areas, it starts to become a problem. Now, I'm not for I think it's something that we just have to confront, and it then sort of displaces that demand to peripheral neighborhoods. This is one part of the housing problem. Obviously, there's like a large, I think, but it is one. So I think that's where I'm sort of equivocal about it. I don't think it's, and the reason for those land prices going up is also complicated, but one source is certainly demand. So
here's an interest. Two people kind of agreed on this question, and it goes with your slide of the homeless encampment. What lessons can we learn from the homeless encampment and the successes that were achieved?
Yeah, I mean, I was I wrote an opinion piece about this, and maybe I can find it and link to it in shortly. But with the housing advocate Stephanie Senna, who basically about the growth of these encampments in general. So one, I just want to note that not just this specific encampment, but many encampments have grown since the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And we just are going to. This is a sign of the housing crisis, of the affordable housing crisis, of the housing crisis of 2007, 2008. I mean, I think it's accumulated. And so the protest encampment, and I don't want to speak for the organizers. I was not one. I was supportive of the aims of the encampment, but I want to applaud, but also not take credit for anything here. But we're able to make a very clear demand and achieve it by staying power. As someone who was involved in Occupy Wall Street at a certain point, it's kind of the opposite effect. You have a clear demand and you achieve it. I think it sets a precedent. I think it's just important to think about vacant housing, whether that's housing authority housing, which is complicated, the scattered site housing that belongs to the PHA. I don't pretend to know the ins and outs of how that housing can be transferred, because housing authorities are connected to federal authorities in ways that sometimes make it difficult for cities or states to act in ways that we would want, even though the state creates the housing authority. But I think it just sets a precedent for transferring land to land trusts and to expanding. And so to what extent, how can we encourage that? How can we scale that up? What is the funding that's needed? What are the mechanisms that are needed? What is the kind of governance that we need for those, for land trusts? I mean, I think that's the precedent that it sets. And the other thing that it sets, and this is speaking to Bauer's point as well, is that it's an organized demand. That was what the Labor Housing Conference was. That was what led to the Carl Mackley homes. It is an organized group of people seeking housing. And that is the essential part of it. One can't just simply propose these things. We can't expect them to happen rationally. We need pressure.
And here, thank you. And here's a lengthy question from John Geeding, which I'm going to summarize a little bit. He comments that on the West Coast, a number of states have made moves regarding the preemption of local zoning, where the local zoning is viewed as excessively single family or excessively mandating expensive units that are by no means affordable. And he refers to both the Mount Laurel decisions in New Jersey and some case law in Pennsylvania. And he suggests that the state could put more muscle into that. And I'm not sure whether it implies so much for Philadelphia or for the suburban communities, but it's a very interesting point in that the controversy over large lot zoning, which was the Mount Laurel case, exclusionary zoning, led to a real reform in housing and zoning in New Jersey, where every community had a target, and that target had to be met. And the targets were like a market; they could be transferred. You could target a community that could not build affordable housing in adequate numbers to meet its target, could transfer that target to a city which wanted to do that. I don't think Pennsylvania has anything like that right now. Is that something that could be an important tool here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to that. I'm not familiar with the case law, so I don't want to sort of speak out of turn. But broadly speaking, I followed the SB 50, I believe it was. It was 827 and then 50, the Scott Wiener bills with interest, and then some of the legislation, the legislation in Massachusetts as well, Minneapolis, that tried to preempt local zoning ordinances and things like that. I mean, I think to build the kind of housing, any kind of housing, but certainly social housing, you need a lot of the restrictions are in the zoning code, and of course neighborhood associations sometimes and things like that. So I just don't, I'm open to that idea, and I mean I certainly support, I would say, an end to any kind of restrictions that would prevent the construction that would prevent construction of housing of that kind. I want to just say that, and this was true in SB 50. This was true in there's a recognition that changes in zoning of that kind can sometimes send out market signals that then increase prices, and so they're paired with affordable provisions, renter protections, with density bonuses and things like that. How that works how that works for the Pennsylvania case, we're exploring it. I will just say that I'm interested in it. We're exploring it from our office. So I'm very interested, is what I would say.
Here's a question from a city official from the Planning Commission. There is a very strong bias against any type of rental housing in most of the city's neighborhoods, even affordable units. Most residents view renters as transient and not invested in the communities in which they live. How do we change this mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I'll take that question a little bit from the political perspective. I just, there is this perception, I believe, that, and it has some basis in reality, but Philadelphia has a high proportion of home ownership. That Pennsylvania, and as a commonwealth, has people who own homes. But of course, over half of Philadelphians are renters. A large proportion of the tenants, there's just a higher proportion of lower income Black and brown tenants in Philadelphia as well, compared with homeowners, even though there is a larger, there is a large proportion of homeownership among Black and brown residents as well. But so the result of that is like a kind of political perspective that that homeowners, I mean, there's political science literature around this about homeowners and home voting and things like that. That tends to distort the political perspective. And the other thing is that homeowners, I am one. I've been a renter until 2 years ago. I was a renter for 20 years. You have more avenues within the federal government. You have more forms of subsidy. You have more ways of negotiating the terms of your mortgage. That doesn't say that people aren't in incredible forms of debt right now and are on the verge of foreclosure, the tenants have many fewer rights, frankly. And so now there's much more awareness, I would say, partly due to tenant organizing among political authorities. And I believe that we need that in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania generally. So I guess I would agree. I think there's a kind of segmentation or an unwillingness to think about tenants, and I think that has changed, to a large degree. But we have political figures in city council right now who are strong advocates, I would say.
There were also a group of questions that I think you did address, but I wonder if you have any further comments on. Well, one question was of the tone of the unions are struggling now, and so how can they undertake such cooperative efforts when their own existence is threatened? Was one question, which I'm paraphrasing, and other questions implied or the need for, shall we say, enabling legislation or other incentives to create stable nonprofit entities that could do this. And certainly the land trust seems to be the first one that everyone mentions. But going further from that, is there anything that, again, that might be in the area of state legislation ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, so the answer is, I don't have a solid answer to this. I think that we, and it was really writing this talk, I started to think more deeply about it, although I have some friends in the labor movement who are very interested in the history of cooperative housing and trying to resurrect it in various ways. I think that I'll go back to the point that, and you raised it, I think we need to find legislation that enables not just the creation and designation of places that it makes it easier for designations like land trusts, but also creates stable funding and subsidies for it. I think we can't pretend that people are going to come up with this kind of equity on their own terms. So that's one part of it. In terms of the labor movement and cooperative housing, I think I would encourage that kind of activity. It's a question for the labor movement largely, and so, but to the extent that we can work together to kind of to make that possible, I think it's valuable. Again, it's the kind of thing that needs dedicated subsidies and funding. But it speaks to the larger, what that state legislation would be, I'm not sure. But but it speaks to the larger point that we need a variety of mechanisms, that to attack the affordable housing problem. And the point that I think Bauer made, which is that you want to make, if there is an organized group of people demanding housing, that is the kind of surest way to create legislation. It's not a sort of rational idea that you just come up with and then people act on it. You're sort of responding to a demand for it.
Right. I think at this point, I will ask Eli if he wants to set any limits on us. We could certainly go on for another hour here, I think, but I'm asking for guidance from
take one more question and we'll wrap this up. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Okay.
So while George is picking out that last one, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. We will be posting this under the events tab on our website. So if you want to share it, watch it again for just to pick out any details, that will be going up. If you go to our events tab under today's presentation, we'll add a link in there so that you can watch this and share it around as you would like. You find it, George?
Yeah, I found a question. There was a question here about linking tax abatements or other benefits for housing, linking them to the resident rather than to the and not the developer. that is, in other words, if a low-cost housing benefit goes with the individual rather who occupies the house rather than to the owner of the property, is the way I'm.
Oh, I see. So if you're a renter in a tax abated home, is that the?
I guess it's another. I mean, it's certainly something that the people who advocate Section 8 would agree. That was the principle behind Section 8.
Yeah, that is, yeah. Or that's another way to describe it. Yeah, I mean, I would maybe take this question. I think we just need, when we think about abatements and things of that kind, I think, actually the this is not the city council candidate who was running last year, Justin DiVerdinis, was proposing this, that, more connections of abatements to preservation, to green or passive housing, things like that. I think there are precedents for that elsewhere. That's sort of that's where I take things like when we think about restructuring abatements and things like that. That's where I see the value being. But I don't know if that quite answers the question, but that's.
Well, I think it does address it. I guess it's now. I think I got a yes from the person who asked the question. So that I hope I did address it or translated it fairly. It's my great pleasure to thank you so much for all the work that you put into this presentation, for your wisdom, and we wish you. I think I can state that we wish you great success in Harrisburg and in your representation in the state. So thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you, George. Thank you to DAG for the invitation. I want to just mention, since we're in a position, at least in theory, to act on some of these things and some of the questions that were raised in the chat. My great hope here is that everyone who is interested in this work, who is interested in the future of affordable housing and housing in Philadelphia and the Commonwealth, we are interested in those ideas. We are interested whether they touch on zoning or social housing or passive housing. I mean, like we ran on a platform that touched on all of those things. I ran on that. We're trying. We have an office that is open to ideas around housing and has considerable interest in it. So I would just encourage people to get in touch through our office. They can reach out to I'll put this in the chat. I believe it's Saval at pasenate.com. That's a good way to get in touch. And then our phone number, I believe, is on the website. I don't happen to know it off the hand, but yeah, thank you so much. Thanks. And thank you for the opportunity to talk through this stuff. This is important to me.
And we will certainly be we'll be following along, and we'll invite you to come back and pop in on our announcement section as legislation is coming up, and anything we can do to support your efforts, please let us know, because it was an absolute privilege to have you with us. And as we wrap up, I shamelessly threw that Dig Deep for DAG campaign link in the chat. So if you like programming like this, please click on there and send a few bucks our way so we can keep providing it. And until January 14th, I'll wish everyone a happy holiday, and we'll see everyone in the new year. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.